WP, the local museum is run by an eccentric old man who knows the opening pieces like he was there for their whole history. His secret? He's a secret dragon who figured out if you display your hoard, people will give you new things to display. So you saw? Yeah. Mr. Gold sighed, looked at the ground, and folded his gnarled hands together. I'd never paid much attention to his hands before. Now that I did, I saw the telltale long fingernails that were more pointed than rounded at the ends. Around us were glass cases full of toys, bisque dolls, metal cars, tin toy soldiers, wooden animals. Usually the museum felt friendly. Today it felt like the toys were judging both me and the old man who took care of them. Directly behind Mr. Gold was a smiling plastic robot with removable gears and a top hat. It was supposed to whistle when you turned it on. MR. Machine. Ideal. 1960s. I don't suppose you want to keep working here. Then Mr. Gold said. Huh. His words surprised me. What are you talking about? Not many people want to apprentice under a dragon. Even one who's damn near perfected the art of shapeshifting. He said. It's bad luck. I'm not an apprentice. I'm a part-time employee. I said. And I still want to work here until school starts up in the fall. This is the best job I've ever had. I was afraid you'd say that. Mr. Gold said. He shook his head, jostling his thick round glasses. Then he opened a case and took out a small bisque doll of an impish cartoon baby wearing a soldier's belt and a hand-painted Prussian helmet. Cupid. Rose O'Neill. 1910s. Tell me, how much do you know about these toys? He asked, putting the Cupid back. I dunno, I said as he picked up a hollow die-cast car and rolled it across the reception desk. Mercedes-Benz. Tootsie Toy. 1940s. If you had to guess, how many do you think you could name? He asked. I looked around the room, trying to gauge how much I knew. Teddy Ruxpin. Hasbro. Chatty Cathy. Mattel. Tubby the dog. Inco. A lot of them. I shrugged. Then your fate is already sealed. Mr. Gold said. Fate? The dragon's curse. He said, looking over at a rare doll from the 1960s. She wore a patched burlap sack and had oversized eyes complete with a fat tear rolling down her cheek. I had the impression that her sadness was for me. Little Miss No Name. Hasbro. 1960s. Should you willingly choose to apprentice under a dragon? Mr. Gold continued. You enter into a contract with him, a contract which incurs a horrible curse. I'd made the mistake of taking on an apprentice in the mid-1800s. I swore I'd never do it again. I shuffled in my spot. I didn't want to believe what the old man was saying. But after seeing him crammed into his office with scales and wings, I wasn't sure it was wise to distrust him. Passing down the knowledge of one's ward seals a curse, he said. But, fortunately for you, it also teaches you how to endure it. What is the curse? My words trembled at the edges. What's going to happen to me? Old knowledge really does die after a time, he said. He pulled a wacky bird novelty pen off of the reception desk and swiped its fluffy feather hair across my face. I sneezed out a small burst of fire. If you're already doing that, then I've taught you more than I thought, said Mr. Gold. A smoke trailed from my nostrils. You'd be wise to select your hoard quickly, unless you want to get stuck collecting old bottle caps till the end days. For more weirdness, visit our Octopus Tales. Asterisk. The old man enjoyed his evening walk around his museum that night, like every other night he usually does, walking amongst the greatest treasures he had collected in his unnaturally long life. For among all the history and mystery each and every artifact on that room held, he himself was the most interesting one. The oldest living dragon in disguise. The last of his kind, Angkor. The grey dragon had outlived his past to the present, though he never left his love of hoarding treasures. With a huge smile he passed through glass displays on his right and left. Authentic armor from the Crusade. Samurai armor from ancient Japan. Musket from the American Civil War. All were collected firsthand by Angkor as he made his way to the center of the exhibition. The room was almost empty as closing time had drawn nearer. Guests were slowly leaving. But one figure remained on the center exhibit. It was an elderly man. Standing in front of the ancient Europe exhibit, he was almost unmoving from the glass case containing a sword. A display of masterful craftsmanship. Made only for the finest knight during the time. The man was studying it intensely, it seemed, as Angkor approached him. Beautiful. Isn't it? Angkor started as he stood beside the man. It is. Yes. It is. The man muttered with his gravelly voice. Something about the man bothered Angkor almost immediately. He shook his head, though he managed to make it unnoticeable. Shrugging it off as exhaustion from his part, he continued. A treasure from the 4th century. Recovered from a supposed battle between a knight and a dragon. Legend has it this very blade slayed said dragon. Angkor explained. Deep down very humid, as the dragon in question was himself. And he was pretty much alive. Is that so? The man muttered, still not taking his eyes off the sword. Although I know for a fact the knight did not slay the dragon. Angkor frowned. Curious. He inquired further. No? How did you know he did not? Angkor said before coughing. Oh, excuse me. The elderly man grabbed the pendant hanging from his neck as he spoke. I know for a fact the knight did stab the dragon and it escaped to the open sky. The sword was still stuck on its belly when he did. Angkor coughed harder as he began to feel nauseous. What? What are you? The elderly man turned to Angkor. Seeing his face, Angkor's eyes widened. Why, you? Angkor growled. His control over his disguise began to slip. Dragon's Bane cologne. Do you like it? The elderly man smirked. You'll be fine. Dragon. It simply weakens you. It wouldn't kill you, St. George. Angkor growled with spite. His appearance began to change. His fingers turned to claws. His tail dropped to the floor. His wings began to sprout from his back, ripping his old suit apart. What do you want? Angkor exclaimed in disgust. How are you still alive? He asked the more appropriate question. As Angkor transformation completed, the old knight stood calmly before the hissing dragon, looking up to the snarling beast. He was unperturbed, still holding the pendant hanging from his neck. I just want my sword back, he said. With his elbow he crushed the glass containing the sword and he grabbed it by the hilt, pulling it out. St. George brandished the blade before the dragon like he did centuries ago. No. Angkor growled. You will not take my treasure. Angkor took an attacking stance, ready to lunge towards his old nemesis. But to his surprise, the knight lowered his sword. I knew you wouldn't cooperate at first. That's why I came prepared. But, dragon, all I want to do is to talk. St. George smiled. Talk? There's nothing to talk about. Angkor screamed. Do you know what this is? St. George cut Angkor off, showing the dragon his pendant. Angkor looked at the black gemstone hanging from the knight's neck, sniffing it a bit. From it he caught a scent of something familiar, something of magical nature. Enchanted stone. Angkor confirmed before looking back at the sword on St. George's hand, to the empty hole on the center of its hilt. Part of the sword. St. George nodded. They were together once upon a time. You know what they did? Dragon? They enchanted this stone and the sword, tying it to my life force. For as long as this sword existed, I cannot die. St. George reunited the two pieces back together. As the black gemstone was put into the slot, a ringing noise came from it as the stone turned white. When I stabbed you and you ran with the sword, this stone fell from it. St. George began to tell his story with an air of sadness on his face. I've searched for it for centuries. Dragon. Searching for you. Before I knew it, centuries turned to millennia. And in my quest I had forgotten the reason I set on this quest in the first place. But as time went, well, I gained a new purpose. St. George looked up to Angkor with teary eyes. I just want to die. Dragon. He muttered. Angkor was taken aback. The brave knight that faced him all those years ago. The figure he had hated and feared for centuries now stood before him, a helpless man. Never he thought he would feel sympathetic towards the old knight. I've lived for far too long. Everyone I knew had long gone and nobody even remembers me anymore. So if you please, dragon, just grant me this one wish. Please destroy this completed sword, so I can finally rest in peace. St. George knelt before the dragon, propping himself with a sword, bowing his head to his enemy. Angkor was silent for a moment. He was hesitant to destroy his precious artifact. But the old knight before him he couldn't turn away from. All those years fearing and hating him. The one thing he hated to admit, but it was true, the courageous knight was the one figure he's ever respected. The dragon lowered his head until it's level with the knight. Softly he blew his fiery breath towards St. George, slowly melting the sword in the old knight behind it. Feeling the heat, St. George smiled. He was grateful. Thank you, he muttered over and over again. As the silver metal slowly melted, St. George looked up for one last time to the dragon. Before I go, tell me your name. Dragon Angkor. The dragon whispered in between the fiery breath. St. George bowed his head for one last time as he felt weaker by the second. For years he has eluded death. He was finally within its reach. Thank you, Angkor. Thank you, my friend. St. George said weakly before he withered to ashes. Ah, hangry Ritty.